Good evening, good night, everybody. Thank you once again for coming back to Experience, Excuse Me, Doctor, our Facebook Live, YouTube Live. We're here every Monday night at 9 p.m. East Coast time, 6 p.m. West Coast time. Thank you so much for joining. And I hope you're bringing your questions tonight because we have another wonderful panel that is waiting to take your questions. This time it's award winning journalists. We're going to be talking with folks from the media, different areas: print, TV, online journalism. And we're going to have a great show. And we're going to recap the week like we always do. So, before we start, I hope you all are comfortable out there. I hope you have your favorite beverage, you got your healthy snack, you're in your comfy PJs, whether they be your daytime or your nighttime PJs, and you're ready just to ask questions, get your questions answered, and hopefully learn something new. So, we are going to be talking again about the media, and I'm waiting for the media coverage rather of COVID-19. I'm waiting for folks from YouTube to show up and all my Facebook family to be in the house. Okay, I see everybody starting to arrive. Wonderful. So I think that we can go ahead and get started very shortly. Great. I see more and more people coming in. So let's go ahead and get started for the week of June 29th. Excuse me, doctor. We're going to start with our weekly recap as usual. And it's been another roller coaster ride of a week in the world, and also with everything happening with COVID-19 and the pandemic. So we're seeing skyrocketing numbers in multiple states. And it's now clear that those skyrocketing numbers are not due to just more testing, because we are seeing more hospitalizations and we're seeing the percent positive of cases go up as well. And so in our southern states, in our western states, especially Florida, Arizona, and Texas, there's some serious issues going on with cases going up, people getting hospitalized, and we're pretty certain, unfortunately, that this is going to translate into increasing death rates. And it begs the question, what happened to flattening the curve? I mean, that whole phrase just went out the window. I mean, we heard about it for several weeks, and then it's like crickets when it comes to flattening the curve. And if you remember, that meant slowing down the spread of the virus so that people who got it, that the rise and the increase of new cases daily would be one that the hospital system in whatever area the pandemic was spreading to would be one that hospitals could manage. But unfortunately, as we started to reopen prematurely, that flatten the curve concept seems to have just disappeared, and places are not adhering to the criteria of 2 weeks in a row of cases going down. So as we've reopened, we've seen cases again take off because community spread was never at a place where it was manageable. So we're seeing bars close, we're seeing beaches being closed for the July 4th weekend, and, people being upset. But unfortunately, because we have not adhered to the basic wearing a mask, staying indoors, not going out if you don't feel sick, all the behaviors, actually people have been fighting wearing masks in many of the places where we're now seeing ICUs filled up. And it's very unfortunate, and whenever possible, encourage those around you to wear masks and reassure them that it does not block the flow of oxygen. And then we're also seeing that today, as of today, the federal government is going to stop supporting with federal dollars testing sites in many places, especially Texas, which is where the numbers are going up most rapidly. So we're going to have to keep an eye on all those developments But again, this is definitely not over. And we see the numbers scrolling by on the bottom of the screen. Confirmed cases over 2.59 million, deaths 128,000 deaths in the United States, and thankfully recovered almost 800,000 people. So staggering numbers. We're glad for the recoveries, but we have to continue to stay vigilant. Next thing, the vaccine trials. So I posted on my Facebook page an article about vaccine trials starting in South Africa. That's not the only place they're starting. And the ones that are being done in South Africa are actually being run by the group out of England, Oxford University, that has developed a vaccine against COVID-19, and they are testing in South Africa, the UK, and Brazil. Meanwhile, here in the United States, a vaccine developed by NIH, as well as a company called Moderna, is starting clinical trials in Bethesda, Maryland, Decatur, Georgia, which is right outside of Atlanta, and Seattle, Washington. And those clinical trials, are in various stages of development. And I submit that it is very important to do clinical trials all across the world in various places and in various populations, because that's the only way that we're going to know whether a vaccine actually works on the broad variety of people that will need to receive it in order to build herd immunity. And again, that's the critical number of the population getting to 70% who have immunity and have antibodies against COVID-19. The quickest and safest way to get there is through a vaccine. And I know there's a concern about vaccines causing problems, actually, health issues. It's actually the reason that they get tested is more often because we need to make sure that they're effective and they actually are building immunity, and not so much that they're going to cause serious health issues. But of course, the clinical trials are designed to make sure that that doesn't happen. And when those results come out, believe me, I'm going to be going over them with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that the science is right and that there has been enough of an observation period to ensure that there is safety and efficacy around that vaccine. So, there's also another reason that I wanted to mention around people of African descent participating in clinical trials. I know that there has been a lot of issues regarding medical malpractice, medical research malpractice, medical abuses against Black people and people on the African continent. There was a famous trial in Nigeria where a pharmaceutical company gave young children medications without getting consent. And thankfully, since then, that was just in 1996, there have been a lot more stringent rules put in place to protect against medical abuses in clinical trials. The fact of the matter is, people of African descent, we have the greatest amount of genetic diversity because we've been on the planet the longest. And so if something is helpful to us, chances are it'll be helpful to everybody in the world. If something is harmful to us, chances are it'll probably be harmful to everyone in the world. That being said, every clinical trial, every vaccine trial must be done with the highest ethical standard because the stakes are very high. Now, next thing, pregnant women and COVID. So we heard early on in the pandemic that pregnant women are no greater increase for issues related to their health from COVID-19 versus non-pregnant women. But unfortunately, this week we found out otherwise as we've gotten more experience around treating women who are pregnant who get COVID-19. And it does show, unfortunately, that pregnant women are at higher risk for getting sicker from COVID-19 and ending up in the ICU. It doesn't seem that the rates of pregnant women dying from COVID are higher than women of the same age who get COVID. So that's a good bit of news. However, it's important that if you're thinking about getting pregnant or if you're already pregnant, working out a plan with your OBGYN and also minimizing your chances of being exposed and being in environments where you might contract COVID-19. And then it's also important to know another bit of medical news around COVID, that patients with cancer, it's now clear there's a higher risk subset of patients with cancer. It's those patients who've been treated with medications that actually rev up the immune system so that it can attack cancer cells. Those individuals now appear to be at higher risk for COVID-19. And you might have heard some of the names of these drugs. They advertise them on TV: Opdivo, Keytruda, Tecentriq, Yervoy, are some of the names of these drugs that are called immune system enhancers, essentially, or immune gatekeepers. And we are now seeing, unfortunately, that people who are on these medicines tend to be at higher risk for COVID-19 and should definitely be working with their oncologist to take the highest level of precautions against getting any infection. So, some good news. Protests had no net effect on COVID-19 cases. So they looked at cell phone data in cities and found, wow, some of those cities where the protests were held, actually the majority of them, numbers actually went down. And we're thinking that it's because, enough protesters had masks on. They were moving throughout the crowd, so they weren't around any one person for a long amount of time. And then they also had on masks. So, and they were outside, actually, most importantly. So we see that was also good. And also they think that people stayed home to avoid the protesters, maybe those people who were more vulnerable. So therefore there was actually a net less spread in cities where protests were held. So that's great news. So we're going to move to our weekly debunk now that we finished the recap for the week. So what is the weekly debunk this week? Requiring me to wear a mask violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. Well, we've seen that there's this group that is acting like they're a government agency. They have like 5,000 people on their Facebook group, and they're printing up these ID cards for people to take to stores and say that they have a disability. And if you question them about their disability, that the store has to pay $75,000 and that they have to be admitted because it's against the Americans with Disabilities Act. Well, this group is not legitimate. The Justice Department has come out and said, basically debunked them. They are not for real. The card is a fake. And what they're contending is that masks block the flow of oxygen, so people shouldn't be required to wear them. That is patently false. We know that surgical masks and cloth masks are actually protecting you from spreading the virus to other people. So it saves lives, and it allows for oxygen to flow in the sides because there are gaps on the side. Again, N95 masks are not meant for people to wear out in the streets. They're only for healthcare providers. And even healthcare providers who wear surgical masks in the hospital, a surgeon wears a mask sometimes for 12, 14, 15 hours in surgery and has no problem breathing. And the same with surgical nurses and other OR staff. So surgical masks, cloth masks should not be a problem. All right. So that is the end of our weekly debunk. And now I'm really excited to welcome this next panel. I have to say I've known each of them for over 20 years, which is kind of crazy to say. But without further ado, I'm going to bring them on. They're each very special people. The first is Deborah Barry. She is a national correspondent for USA Today. She's part of the National Enterprise team and covers a range of issues with a focus on civil rights, voting rights, and the census. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner. She's also won the 2019 National Association of Black Journalists Award for her coverage of Black women candidates for Congress. So, thank you so much for joining us, Deborah.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And our next guest is Vanessa Kay Deluca. She's the editor-in-chief of Zora Magazine by Medium, which is an online publication for, by, and about women of color. She also recently served as editor-in-chief of Essence magazine. She's an award-winning journalist herself and co-author of the best-selling beauty and empowerment book, Tyra Banks' Beauty Inside and Out. She regularly appears on national television shows like CBS This Morning and the Today Show, so we're very happy to have her here with us tonight. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, happy to be here.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Angelique Proctor is a reporter for Fox 5 News in Atlanta, Georgia. She's been there for several years, but she's worked in many markets, including Florida, Ohio, and other places in Georgia. She's covered stories from around the world. She's won several awards herself, including 3 Emmys and the Associated Press Best Newscast and the National Association of Black Journalists Award for her report on the Rosewood Massacre. Welcome, Angelique.
Good evening to all.
So thank you all for being here. You know, so many of us, including myself, have relied on the media to keep up with what's going on in the pandemic. And I know each of you have played your own role in the coverage that we've seen. But the first question I want to start out with, and I guess we will go to Angelique first. You know, how has the government confusion, whether it has been on federal level, state level, and the mixed messages affect your ability to report?
Well, Melissa, as a news reporter, one of the things that I do is go to news conferences. Many of those news conferences are often called by politicians. So what I learned quickly into covering COVID-19 is you don't listen to the politicians. So the folks that I've been focused on more so are the doctors who are standing with them. So as the nation watched President Donald Trump giving his nightly news conferences early on in COVID, and we saw flanked through his right or left, Dr. Anthony Fauci, that is sort of who I gravitated toward. Same thing here in Georgia. Brian Kemp is our governor, and he has a doctor, Dr. Kathleen Toomey, who is our Secretary of Georgia Department of Public Health. And she also is a doctor. These people had more of a they had more of a actual knowledge of what we were dealing with COVID-19. So those are the folks that I listened to because, as you recall, the president was saying things as outrageous as we should inject disinfectant. And so we listened more to those doctors. And many of those doctors were criticized initially and told that they were exaggerating the situation. I recall Dr. Fauci saying that we would have, you know, thousands and thousands of people to die, tens of thousands. And many people said that was exaggerated, but a lot of that has come to pass. And so to get away from all of the false narratives, I followed the doctors. Another good source was the CDC here in Atlanta. They have a lot of good information on their website, and then the Georgia Department of Public Health.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I mean, you have to have a great amount of insight, obviously, to be able to report accurately. And I think, the next person I want to go to is Deborah Barry, because you wrote a story, Deb, that was published on March 30th in USA Today about the possibility that COVID-19 would report and would result in disproportionate effects on communities of color. Mm-hmm. And so, you were almost prescient as far as, other journalists are concerned and being able to see that coming down the pike. What sort of clued you into that? And maybe you could expand on why you think maybe other reporters didn't pick up on that earlier.
Sure. Well, Lisa, as you know, fairly recently, I was a congressional correspondent for USA Today. So part of what I covered was the Deep South. So it's hard to say you can't cover the Deep South. If you cover the Deep South, you know that you're always going to be dealing with issues of disparity, whether it be in education, housing, and particularly in health. So I had already been writing about disparities, health disparities. So that was already on my radar. But what kind of started to stand out was when experts and others were talking about some of the underlying conditions. Mm-hmm. And knowing that many people of color disproportionately are affected by those conditions kind of was like a red flag. Well, if that's the case, then what does that mean for people of color? And then, of course, I asked you on one of your panels. In fact, you were the first person I asked that. And you made it clear that, yes, that population could be vulnerable, not so much to the virus, as you explained, but to the impact of it with the conditions they had. So, frankly, after asking you that question and getting your response, I went and sought out other experts and advocates and others who can speak to whether that is a possibility, including members of Congress, particularly the CBC members. And they all made it perfectly clear that, yes, it could happen. And yes, unfortunately, it wound up kind of playing out. When you asked about others, I don't know that anybody else hadn't already thought about it or wrote about it in some ways, but I think initially I don't think everyone necessarily initially connected the dots, especially since early on there wasn't much data or stats on the racial breakdown.
Right.
So therefore it was hard to see and at least to notice early on.
Exactly. And especially early on, since many black people, the rumor was circulating that, we couldn't get COVID. So, we have that kind of misinformation to also counteract. So I think your article was just so timely because it was one that sort of said, wake up, hey y'all, this is coming down the pike. So, Vanessa, I think you're in a really unique position because you're getting to see sort of the insight of your various writers that are writing from different aspects and different angles about this pandemic, and especially hearing from the voice of Black women. How would you say that the concerns that are echoed in those stories may differ from the general population when it comes to COVID-19, or, may just be reflective of the general population?
Well, it's interesting because when we talk about, like, as you just mentioned, that there's this false idea that we didn't get COVID. We use this opportunity to tell the stories to humanize our women and to humanize the experiences that people were going through. So we did stories that were mostly a lot of personal essays talking about the impact of COVID on a young Black woman who had just found herself catching the virus, stories about how it impacts on our families. How do you have a conversation with your child about COVID-19? Stories about, relationships. How do you have long distance, social distancing relationships with others? And workplace issues, how do you keep your job and your sanity when you're dealing with COVID and trying to work and battle this pandemic? So there are so many stories that we found that could be told that it's amazing to me that anyone would think that this pandemic doesn't have an impact on us specifically, but in general.
Right. And I think to pick up on that, how this intersection of systemic racism with COVID-19 and police brutality and all the other places where we're seeing systemic racism, how would you say that has affected your coverage or the stories that you're receiving? And I'll put that out to any of you.
Well, I'll say that it's really transformed what we're covering on Zora. Literally, there was a literal pivot from covering, the usual stories that we would used to connect to audiences. But then when COVID-19 came, it was like all hands on deck. We really need to be covering this pandemic. And then once the protests started, it was another pivot to make sure that we were recognizing and telling the stories of the people and their experiences. I think it was for us a very easy decision to make because we are so focused on women of color. It just made the most sense. And it is the information that our audience is looking for. They want that timely, very much like what you're doing, Melissa. They want that timely, of the moment information, and want to know about the impact.
Absolutely.
And, and for us, I mean, we're talking about news of the day, so you can't, ignore the fact that COVID was the news of the day, and like Vanessa, we had all hands on deck. Everybody was covering it. Some of us were, particularly focusing on people of color, communities of color, but then the other civil rights issue of the day, of course, is the protest and what the underlying impact, how that came about, why it's still happening. Together, I mean, that's all our headlines, all our stories, or that's our headlines. And then, to be honest, too, there's an awakening, if you will, in the media too, from the big papers to the little papers to all of our news organizations. Probably they're now saying, you know what, we really need to cover this in every aspect of it, both now and going forward.
Right.
And I was going to say with Fox News, we were all evolving, but we have a newscast that starts at 4:30 and runs until 7. And I would say the lion's share of that news, 80% of it, was about COVID initially. We had our sportscasts that were suspended. Weather got, 2 or 3 minutes, and it was all in for COVID, all aspects. And then once we hit the protesters, it was all in that way. And so we had to definitely make a shift. And it just was very overwhelming because in both instances, it was like our community was coming up short. And I remember a lot of my colleagues reaching out to me saying, how are you doing? Because I did so many stories on the deaths of people with COVID. And these were people who were not sick. It comes to mind the Arbor Terrace story that I covered, which is an assisted living facility, upscale assisted living facility with some 60 residents. 18 of them died, and these were our heroes and sheroes. We're talking about in a couple of cases, a husband and a wife both passed away. A doctor and his wife. These were principals. I remember one man was a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, and they were all succumbing to the COVID. And so it just, by death 7, death 8, and then here I came back, death 12.
Yeah.
And it was like, when does this end? And it just continued until it got to 18. And then that story kind of started evolving to the point that I was talking to the owners to try to figure out what is happening here, because they had some 40 facilities nationwide in 11 states. And it was only at Arbor Terrace where they were seeing the type of death rates that they had. And even the residents there, some 80%.
Which is a predominantly black facility.
Absolutely, it was. And the owners were not African American. And they had these facilities all over the country where they were not predominantly black. And it was only here. And so we immediately asked, well, did you have the PPE? Did you properly train your staff? What went wrong here? And it's still somewhat of a mystery because, again, it was an upscale place. And, you got to wonder about the underlying conditions and what role genetics played. But just this heartbreaking story.
Yeah. I mean, and there has been just this intensity around COVID-19 and the deaths that you mentioned, Angelique, and then rolling right off of that into the covering of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and just like you said, death, death, death everywhere you turn, and the reinforcement of the disparities that as African Americans we have in society. So I was wondering if each of you could kind of tell me how have you been doing your self-care in all of this, right? How are you transitioning from your work life into your personal life and keeping it together? Maybe we could start with you, Vanessa.
Sure. It's not easy. I mean, it's really not easy when you think about how much is happening to our community, in our community, all at once. Like, who could have seen this coming? Who could have predicted it? And part of your job is to cover it and to make sure that those stories are being told and that they're chronicled so that people don't forget what happened and how it happened and why it happened. For me, I try to spend some time away from social media, away from, which is hard, which is really hard, away from social media, away from my computer, which is, always sitting right in my kitchen. That's where I usually prefer to work. And just take a minute and watch something that is mindless and fun and enjoyable, if only for a little bit. That seems to give me a bit of a breather.
Wonderful. What about you, Deb?
Honestly, in the beginning, especially in the beginning, I was overwhelmed, overburdened, and overworked. Um, but what made it even more challenging is most of the time as a reporter, we're usually the observers. We're usually watching from the outside, writing about issues, and then walking away, if you will. But this wasn't one of those stories. It's not only, as we're covering it, we're living it. You
Yeah.
know, I'm writing about people who are dying and who have these underlying conditions, and I'm talking about my family. I'm talking about, my own people. My mother's in New York, so, we were going crazy about her being vulnerable. One of my favorite cousins in New York died. One of my best friends around the corner,
So
he was
sorry.
diagnosed, so he was in the hospital. So while I'm sitting here writing about it,
Yeah,
I'm praying in the background that my people are okay, and
sure.
then going back to work. So it, it I've been a journalist for a long time, and I've covered a lot of stories. This one hit home in a whole lot of ways, not just as covering the big story, but kind of living the big story, and
Yeah,
the disproportionate impact of people of color. I shouldn't say hurt, but I felt it a lot more because
sure.
it didn't stop and it kept
Mhm.
happening, and
Yeah,
I don't know that enough government, enough people paid enough attention to address it.
yeah.
I still don't know that they have or we have. So
That's right.
I haven't figured out how to do a good job at Melissa, but I'm working on it.
I would
Well,
agree
we
with.
are all doing it. We're all a work in progress, and then we're all. This is the first time for all of us, and I'm so sorry to hear, about your cousin. And I think you said that journalists are observers. I heard Angelique though talk about asking those hard questions to that assisted living nursing home skilled nursing facility there in Atlanta. So also from a self-care standpoint, I mean, you're also juggling too. I know you have concerns about older people in your family. So how have you also juggled your self-care plus also worrying about the welfare of your family?
It's been really, really challenging, Melissa. As you know, my elderly mother lives with us, and so that is a constant concern at 79. My husband has underlying conditions, so I'm sleeping with him every night. I'm very concerned there. I've got three teenage children who are raging to go out and go socialize, and so it's just been a whirlwind here. You're talking about self-care. My quietest moment was taking walks in the neighborhood, which was, fairly easy to do because you didn't have to drive to the gym. It was closed. And so that was a good place to just, get a little solace and get your mind back and start feeling yourself again. But once you come back home, it's a story you can't shake because uh, COVID continues. And every day I'm thinking of infection. I've got a routine where I go around, spray the house, or, take take the knobs, clean off all the knobs with the wipes. It's just it's ongoing every day, all day. And you just wonder because I've seen so many people die of COVID in my community. I mean, the woman who coordinated our wedding was one of the first to die at Arbor Terrace. And so I know I even had a great aunt to pass from a suspected COVID case. She was in an assisted living. I know COVID can hit home. And so I'm almost paranoid just trying to prevent it from entering this home. And it's quite a balancing act with these teenagers and my mother all in the same room. but God will get us through. And then that's the other interesting thing. We're not able to go and worship now. The
Yeah.
churches are closed, and so that becomes online, and we're not getting as much support there as we normally get. So it's just a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, it's truly a year of firsts, and we're all taking our time and navigating through this. And then on top of all of that, we have all this misinformation running around. We already talked about some of it about Black people can't get COVID. Have you had to deal with any of that in your work, or are you, when you write a story, have you been getting sort of responses when you write, or have an episode where you talk about something having to do with COVID? Are you getting responses back with misinformation in it, or people protesting what you write or what you publish, or what you air on TV?
In fact, one of the things that I think is particularly frustrating, and I don't know if it's always been misinformation, at least from stories I've had to cover. Most of the time, it's been lack of information. I mean, especially when you started writing about disparities in racial data. Why would the CDC not have that information? Right? So out the box, we're like, okay, you're not giving me the wrong information, but you're not giving me any information.
Right.
So that was just as harmful in some ways. So I think that's been the most frustrating, and then trying to get information out of another agency, and then the frustration of having to go to each state to try to get what should be basic data about the racial breakdown. So it's made it more challenging. And again, I don't know if it's just the misinformation as much as why do you not have stuff that you should have for any health crisis?
Right. Are you finding that there's still some states that are not reporting data?
Some
Racial breakdown?
We have a data team, and they're finding that more and more states are. What I just talked to a professor expert, Dr. Besser, today, I was doing another story. I can't tell you what that is. But I talked to Dr. Besser, and he was talking about how while they're getting more states and counties are providing racial data, he thinks it should go down to the zip code level. He said, because that's when you're going to really start getting where things are happening and where the disparity is or isn't. So you're seeing more. We still haven't seen that big CDC, unless you've seen it, Angelique. I haven't seen it yet, where they had all the big data that you can do the big crunching. It's kind of, we've been going state to state just to gather data and put it together ourselves.
Yes. Which is, I think, criminal, personally, because the data exists out there. There are data banks, like LexisNexis has data down to the block level on things like social determinants of health, which can then be matched with death rates, and you can really start to see where those kinds of patterns emerge, where the disadvantages are. So yeah, I hear you. Anyone else?
Excuse me, doctor.
Oh,
We have a
yes.
question from the West Coast. A question comes from Angela in the West Coast, and she says, what other journalists do they trust for information?
Great question.
Well, let me tell you this. We are always taught and instructed that you don't trust anybody else. You have to find your own information and you have to confirm it yourself. And so, but if we look at one source that's sort of universally used and accepted, I would say it's the AP, the Associated Press, for broadcast. Would you agree with that, Deb?
I would. It's very credible. Yes, I agree. And us, but yes. Yes.
Absolutely. And just to remind everybody, us is USA Today, right? And Gannett. Yeah.
I'm kidding, but yeah.
One thing I was going to say, Melissa, is that I just find it so perplexing that we don't have more information about how people are responding globally to the pandemic, how other countries are making things work. I don't see a lot of that information trickling down, and it almost seems intentional. And it's extremely frustrating because you would think that with all the lessons that have been learned over the past couple of months, that we could all benefit if we were all sharing that information. I don't know how much of that sharing is going on.
Yeah. So, in the medical literature, there definitely is that sharing going on. I mean, people are publishing. Actually, the criticism is that we've been publishing too fast because normally there's a peer review process, and a lot of times in the rush to get information out, that's being bypassed. So that was how when, Deb contacted me about the disparities and the underlying health conditions, I already had that data out of China from medical journals out of China that had been published saying what those underlying health conditions were and the rates at which they were seeing people with those underlying health conditions get sick. I think, though, one of the things, and you all can respond to this, I remember the first time I traveled internationally and I saw CNN International, and I realized it was a different CNN than they show back in the United States because the assumption is that we're not interested in international news. So as far as the media goes in terms of learning information from other countries, I too have seen that there's a dearth. That's one of the reasons why last week the episode we did was actually on the international response, and I had somebody from South Africa, somebody from the UK, and somebody from Jamaica talk about what's happening in their countries because there just doesn't seem to be a lot of information. So since Vanessa was the one who asked the question, I'll turn it back to Deb and Angelique. What do you think could help us on a media and a societal level get more information out there about how other countries are dealing with the pandemic?
I don't. I guess America. I don't know that we haven't. I think we were doing that early on. But then when it comes to hitting home, then America is all about America, unfortunately.
Right.
So I think a lot of the attention has been diverted away from covering other countries because we're focused on us, which is what America tends to do.
Yeah.
And it's almost like we're fumbling the ball so desperately. We need to get our own house in order and then try to figure out what everybody else is doing because we're not managing it as well as many other countries. And probably there are certain people that don't want that information to get out there, that other people are doing a much better job at containing the virus than we are.
The other piece that I've found underreported is how people are surviving with the virus, what's happening afterwards. And I know, Deb, you've written a story about that. What led you to write that story? Because again, that was an episode that I did on, survivors and how they're coping with the after effects. So there's a lot of information out there about not getting it, and about what happens in the hospital sometimes, but not what happens after the hospital. So what gave you the idea to do that, and how did you find your sources for that?
Well, actually, that was a team project. So there were like 4 or 5 of us that were assigned to do that. And part of what we looked at or played into that was that we were all writing so many stories about deaths and how bad it was, which is legit, rightly so. But then we were starting to reach that point where we were about to go to the 100,000 mark, that big news event. And we said, well, you know what? Everybody's not dying who has the virus. So let's talk to the folks who survived. And that story was just as heart-wrenching as the others. Not just, there's a big difference in dying and not, but a lot of the folks we wanted to show the diversity of what happens. Some people were doing okay and moving on. A lot of people were still suffering and had side effects and long lasting. So it became important to tell other stories about it too. And that, yes, you can live. Yes, you may deal with these issues, but let's give these people voice. And we wind up doing a big package about that. And got a lot of feedback because people saw a little bit of hope, if you will, in that.
Yeah. And I know, Vanessa, have you been hearing from people who've survived? Any of the writers submitting stories about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We did a story not too long ago about a young Black woman who had contracted COVID-19, had struggled with it off and on, finally got better, but found that she didn't have any resources really or anyone she could talk to about what she had been through or what she was going through. So she decided to start a Facebook group of her own, where she invited, survivors to be a part of, this group and just help one another. And I thought that was pretty amazing that for someone to even have the strength after everything they've been through, and they have young children, and they have a whole other life, they're just trying to get their life together, to decide that they would put something together for others. I thought was pretty amazing.
That is. And I think one of the conclusions that we had on the panel that I did, there were actually two mental health counselors, one mental health, one more social work, and they both decided that they were going to do a faith-based mental health outreach to individuals who are survivors of COVID-19.
Melissa, can I add something to what Vanessa said? And that
Sure.
was when we talked to, we had to do a lot of sourcing and figure out who and find people. But what struck me was how many people wanted to talk about it. A lot of people really, really wanted to share their stories. Like you said, they started the Facebook page, or they were reaching out in different ways. Everybody we reached out to wanted to tell their story. Even if it was still a hard story to tell, they wanted everybody to know that you can survive, or what it takes, or how there's still struggles afterwards. So please don't forget us. So it was important to do.
Excuse
Now-
me, doctor. We have a question. Our question comes from Marv West. CNN Late Night has an international program. Does anyone know of other international media programs about COVID or other related issues?
Does anyone know about any other international shows or sources?
I'll mention one source that Medium, which Zora is a part of Medium.com. We have a coronavirus blog that we update with information that is, that's ongoing. It's updated every single day, and it shares like the latest information. That's one place where some international stories get shared.
Great. Wonderful. One of the things I also wanted to ask you guys about is, and it may actually pertain more on a local level, but certainly maybe it's percolated up to the national level, is have you seen any sort of stories of communities of color coming together to help their own? And how has that been covered or not covered?
Oh, we are absolutely covering that in the Atlanta area. There are a lot of, we have a city of South Fulton, a recently developed city, some 100,000 people who are donating and giving away food and electrical assistance, utility assistance to people who've lost their jobs from COVID, as well as, and this is an ongoing weekly donation that people can ride up and get assistance and help. And they're even talking about, if you need an appointment just to talk to somebody, mental assistance. So I'm seeing that. I'm also seeing churches that are reaching out and helping people. And these are all people of color. So it's quite encouraging that we are coming together to support each other.
Great.
One of my favorite stories recently, and favorite partly because it was a relief to write something good, was I heard that churches were doing this and a little bit folks were doing that, but we wanted to take a look and kind of do a national piece about what other groups were doing, and particularly groups that were helping communities of color, their community. So I talked to some folks here in DC, Emory Fellowship, and they were doing a food pantry, and they had ramped up their efforts. I talked to some folks in California who were working with migrant farmers, and they were giving out masks and hand sanitizers, and then Chicago, so all over the place. And most of them were saying, and then in Atlanta too, where Project South set up its own testing site, because many of these groups felt like the federal government in particular hadn't stepped up to do enough. So they said, we're going to take care of our own. We're going to take care of our people.
Absolutely.
And the churches were all in that. So it was refreshing. Not that it wasn't already, not that churches and all these groups haven't been doing all this stuff for years and always do, but they as the group and collectively said, we're going to do this and we're going to ramp it, no matter what it takes, because we don't even have the resources. But it was refreshing to write that and to tell it. And there was a lot of good feedback about that too, because folks just wanted folks to know that we're here for you and we got you.
Yes.
Excuse
Absolutely.
me, doctor.
I
We have a
yes.
question coming from Val in Texas. It's amazing to see black women bossed up on for this episode. How do their partners manage or respond to the demands of their jobs?
Wow.
Wow.
Well, I'll start. My partner is producing this, and he's been very supportive. Shout out to Wayne Bruce.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Deb,
Fantastic.
would you like to go next?
Sure. My partner has been my partner for about 20 years, so he's been part of the journalism world for a long time, at least watching what happens. But he's had my back, and he set up this little studio today. So
Funny.
he's had my back on this one, especially on this one.
My partner is my husband, Max. He has been absolutely wonderful. He is constantly giving me story ideas, particularly from the African American community perspective, and the assistance and initiatives that he takes at home with the girls is immeasurable because as COVID has come and the protests, I've been called in to work 6 days a week, more than once, more than twice. And so the house has to keep moving, and he's right there making it happen.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, my
How about you,
partner,
Vanessa?
my husband has been very supportive. In fact, because he's a social worker and some of the stories that we've done, offer advice and tips and help for people to, deal mentally with what's going on with the pandemic and the protests. A lot of times I'll share some of the stories that we've done with him that he can share with some of his clients. So yeah, and that's like a nice connection to have.
I heard Angelique say that her husband Max gives her story ideas, and it just made me have to ask this, and there's probably a last question to go around to everyone. I know certainly being a black woman informs the way that I practice medicine. How would you say that being a black woman in this pandemic has informed the way that you have reported on it or managed the headlines and managed the news in this?
Well, I would say that everything I do, I start as a Black woman. And I think that I, I'm recognized as that in my newsroom. If there's a Black issue, they're going to come to me. I know the movers and the shakers in the Black community, and so I wear it with honor. And when I report my stories, I always try to represent my community in the best light that I can, which is one of the reasons that I press the owners about why is this happening. We need an explanation because it just does not seem just, fair, right. And so there has got to be an explanation, please. And I do that with every story that I approach. I'm very objective, but I always have my community's interest at heart.
Absolutely. Okay.
Well,
Excuse
And I make no apologies for being a black woman. I like
Okay.
being a black woman, and that's what I come to the table with. That that my experience, my life experiences, and like Angelique, knowing the community, having the sources in the community, and frankly, it's not new here, at least for me. My experience at USA Today is that's been respected. There's they can ask me. They hear me. Story ideas I bring to the table are usually well received, and the resources to go with it. So I think depends on your news organization and whether they value that and what your people bring to the table. It could be a good thing, and for me it has been. So I'm using the voice that I have and the platform that we have while we have this window to make sure these stories get told.
Absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. The same, pretty much, I want to say the same thing. Um, when I brought Zora, the idea of Zora to Medium, I told them that I really wanted this to focus on women of color, to be about, by, and for women of color, and that I didn't see any other way to do it because there really wasn't a space where all of these different types of stories were being told. And fortunately, they were, they were open to it, and I really appreciate that so much because there are so many untold stories. I can't tell you how many times people have come to me and say, "I've been holding on to this story, waiting for some place to place it," and they found it with Zora. So that's a great thing.
Fantastic. I did say it was going to be the last question, but I saw one other one flash up on the screen.
This question comes from Ellen Claire Lamb. What are the practical challenges of reporting these stories? Are you able to visit locations and talk to people on site? Is it harder to reach sources in lockdown?
Great question.
Great question.
Thank you, Ellen Claire Lamb.
Very good.
Yes, it is harder to reach sources in a lockdown. People are at home. They're not as accessible. You call an office, nobody's answering. You need to have their home phone numbers, and sometimes they don't have them. You try to get email addresses. And so it's been very challenging, but I'm very determined and I'm going to get it done. And you're talking about being on site. Yes, I am on site. When I'm covering the protest, I am out there on the front lines. And a couple of weeks ago, when Atlanta police deployed tear gas, I was in the vicinity. And my eyes got watered. It was an experience I had never felt before. And so I was a little shaken and surprised. They were ready to come back to me, but I couldn't even talk, so it's real serious being on the front lines. And yes, you're right there in the action. Now, granted, we had security because these protests have gotten you know, very interesting. And we've had people to tell us, particularly covering the Rayshard Brooks case here in Atlanta, down at the Wendy's, the gentleman who was shot. I pulled up there about a week and a half ago to go to a news conference, and my photographer was told that we needed to leave the area. And this was by some people in the neighborhood. They didn't want the media there. And so it can be very serious. So fortunately, the station has provided us security. So everywhere we go now, we have security to go with us to try to ensure our safety.
Wow.
Excuse me, doctor. This is the last question of the evening. Question comes from Vanita Newsom. I'm a black woman and will be getting my undergraduate degree in journalism and media studies next year. Can you give me advice on how to start my career?
Well, congratulations, Vanita. Anybody want to take that one?
Well, I can tell Renita to start writing right now. With online publications, people are always looking for someone to write a story. And you can do that right now. I used to tell people, start writing for your church. But right now, with all of these online opportunities, get published so that you have some work that you can show someone that you're already doing. Or if you're interested in broadcasting, go to a radio station or a television station, and hopefully you can afford to sort of volunteer, tag along, and get that experience through an internship to get some work under your belt, so you have something to show someone.
And just to piggyback off Angelique, is that I'm not sure where you are, but in addition to the internships, make sure you look at your local newspaper. A lot of them are really hurting for bodies and copy, so a lot of them are receptive to having some copy. That would be a good place for you to get published and get started. Make sure you tap into your local black journalism chapter, because I'm sure wherever you are, if there's one there or in your region, make sure you go to the national NABJ coming up.
Convention.
Those are places convention, you can network.
And
make
they
sure
have jobs. People are there offering jobs. Absolutely.
Jobs, right. Especially these days. You'd be surprised, but there are some openings. And make sure you reach out to folks like us who can act as advisors or mentors or just be an ear sometimes. And sometimes that's just what we need is an ear, especially from another journalist of color.
And you, all three of you are on LinkedIn, I'm assuming, in terms of people being able to reach
I'll do
reach
better.
you. Wow. Anything to add, Vanessa?
No, I think that they both Angelique and Deb were just spot on. You know, it doesn't really matter if you have, you know, if you don't have the experience yet. What does matter is that you continue to write and continue to hone your craft, and that's, you know, that's really the key piece to it.
And actually, I think we have some ways to get in touch with you that were flashed up on the screen there. So you don't have to necessarily do better with LinkedIn there, Deb. So that's good.
I still
Right. I
need
was going to
to.
say Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram would be better for us,
There
Yes,
we
for
go.
me.
yes.
All right. Fantastic. Well, I'm almost sorry to wrap up because I've certainly enjoyed talking with the three of you all. I think we see that, you know, why it's so important to have representation of a broad spectrum of people in media. And certainly, we are so happy that we have women of color who have been veterans of the journalism industry with us to lead us in terms of the information that we're getting, do it empathetically and with keen insight, which I think all three of you all epitomize. So thank you so much for being a part of the show tonight. And, you know, we're going into the 4th of July weekend. Everyone, I implore you, please be safe out there. It's not over. We know that cases are going up in many, many places. So if you're going outside, you're going to the beach, you're going to do any sorts of outdoors activity, you know, don't be with the crowd. You know, go to the fringes. If you're going indoors, make sure you're wearing a mask at all times. And it's best just to socialize at home and be as safe as possible. So, next week, I hope to see you right back here at 9 o'clock. We're actually going to be talking about women's health and COVID, especially in light of the information that's come out about pregnant women. We're going to have a prominent OBGYN and a pediatrician who's going to be here to join us. So, I hope you can make it next week with your questions. And tomorrow morning, for those of you who are early risers, I'll be on the Russ Parr Morning Show at 7:45, like I usually am, as a medical contributor, answering Russ and other viewers' questions. So I look forward to hearing or seeing you then. All right, take care. Good night, everybody, and remember, be wise, be well, and be health empowered.